made myself among these rocks. I formed my personality here. I discovered my love. I painted my work. I constructed my home. I cannot separate myself from this sky, this sea, these rocks. I am bound forever to Portlligat, where I have defined all my most sincere truths and my roots.
We are in front of the house at Portlligat Bay, the only home Dalí ever had. And this is important because the whole house can be thought of as a workshop. It was a vital place for him. He needed to soak up the landscape. And this house represented the intimate Dalí, the Dalí who could concentrate, who could create. And above all else, it is the one place in the world where he decided to create a house to live in and a studio in which to paint.
Dalí's relationship with Cadaqués began early. His father, the notary who was born there, had a house on the Esllaner beach. Dalí spent his holidays there and had very fond memories of it, since he associated the village with the summer and free time. Far from his school studies, it was a time he could devote to painting. In his childhood diaries, Dalí, during the winter in Figueres, often recalled Cadaqués wistfully.
I spent a delicious summer, as always, in the ideal and dreamy village of Cadaqués. There, beside the Latin Sea, I gorged myself on light and colour. I spent the torrid days of summer painting frenetically and striving to capture the incomparable beauty of the sea and the sun-drenched beach.
For Dalí, Cadaqués was light, freedom, colour, impressionism, and then Figueres was more functional, the place where he went to school, which he didn't like.
Salvador, who doesn't take holidays as other children do, works constantly, and thus makes the most of our summers in Cadaqués. Many days by sunrise, he is all ready to start painting. On other days, he spends hours and hours in the studio, from the break of dawn until sunset.
His sister, Ana Maria Dalí, 4 years younger than him, was fascinated by her talented brother, for whom she posed as a model and for whom she felt a great affection and closeness.
When he painted me, I was always near a window, and so my eyes had time to fix on the smallest details. The way Salvador's retina captured the atmosphere of the village, the luminosity that filtered into his body and then flowed from his fingers which handled the brushes. It's a process I have always marvelled at, because it is the process that creates the work of art. At home it would take place very often with the greatest simplicity and naturalness.
I was going out with my brushes and my canvases, painting the coast. One day I discovered a hut. From then on, I saved myself the trouble of carrying my materials back and forth. This hut was in a little bay, known as Portlligat, 15 minutes walk from Cadaqués, on the other side of the cemetery.
From this moment on, Dalí intensely explored this new landscape, a setting from which he would never separate himself. He even declared on at least one occasion that he himself was Cap de Creus.
The identification was and is total, so much so that Dalí's work cannot be understood without having visited this landscape.
Portlligat is one of the most arid, mineral and planetary places on Earth. And in this modesty of nature, I discerned the very principle of irony. Observing how the forms of those motionless rocks moved, I meditated on my own rocks, those of my thoughts.
In the bay of Portlligat, there are some huts by the sea. These are ramshackle constructions in which the fishermen kept their tools. One of these huts belonged to a fisherman's widow, Lydia Noguer. The friendship between the young Dalí and Lydia continued until her death, and she would come to play a fundamental role in one of the most difficult moments in the artist's life. In fact, Dalí felt a great fascination for Lydia to the extent of declaring that Lydia possesses the most magnificent paranoid brain, aside from my own, that I have ever encountered.
C'était Lydia, c'était la plus grande paranoïaque qui a jamais existé. Il m'a influencé énormément du point de vue spirituel.
Young Dalí must have been fascinated by Lydia, who told stories to all the children, stories that she quite often took out of the newspapers she used to wrap the fish in she sold. Lydia's madness is a moist, soft madness, full of seagulls and lobsters. It is a plastic madness. Don Quixote rides through the air and Lydia through the air of the Mediterranean. How wonderful Cadaqués is, and how wonderful it is to draw a parallel between Lydia and the last knight-errant.
During Dalí's early years, the landscape, his family, and he himself were the focus of his work, which swung back and forth between tradition and avant-garde. For Dalí, his creative work was also a means of experimentation, which allowed him to open up and to discover the latest tendencies in art. This experimentation led him to Surrealism, a movement of which he became one of the outstanding figures.
And this painting is a reflection of this new line, of amputated bodies, severed hands, arteries, veins. Now time painted in an almost hyper-realist manner, isn't it?
And he feels the need to move on. He feels rather trapped in the classical approach to art.
My brother went to Paris with Louis Buñuel to make the film Un chien andalou, and there he made contact with various members of the Surrealist group who visited Cadaqués that summer. It was the summer of 29. He lost the spiritual peace and the well-being that his work had reflected up until then. The paintings he was making were horribly hallucinatory. What he sculpted on his canvases were authentic nightmares, and those disturbing figures that seemed to want to explain something inexplicable were a torture. Lugubrious Game is the most representative example of the paintings of that period, and the one that most clearly reflects the change in spirit he had undergone.
But it seems to me there were mixed emotions here. It wasn't just surrealism that Anna Maria didn't like. It's rather a familial vision, but it's where Dalí set about finding a style of his own and was able to affirm himself with a specific current, isn't it?
Miro introduced him to Paris society, and most important, he made his first contact with the Surrealists, among them Paul Eluard and the Viscount Noailles, who were to become Dalí's patrons and would have a major role in financing the house in Portlligat. 1929 was a decisive year in Dalí's life. He met Gala, who was to be his partner and muse. Dalí spent the summer in Cadaqués, where he was visited by the gallery owner Goermans and his partner, and also Louis Buñuel, René Magritte, and Paul Eluard and his wife Gala, with their daughter Cécile.
Thus, in 4 days, I found myself surrounded for the first time by surrealists, who were drawn there above all by the remarkable personality they discovered in me, because Cadaqués could offer none of the indispensable amenities of a leisure resort if you didn't have a house of your own there.
And then Dalí dramatized this gathering. It was very important to him. It represented everything he was looking for at that moment. And, as he recounts in fantastical fashion in his autobiography, he fell madly in love with Gala and was eager to impress her.
La première vraie rencontre, j'ai ouvert la porte de ma maison de mes parents et Gala était déjà nue derrière la porte. Alors tout de suite, je me suis formé une espèce de mélange d'excréments de chèvre, parce que les excréments de chèvre, ça m'excite beaucoup sexuellement, alors je pensais que ça allait exciter Gala la même chose, alors j'ai mêlé la colle de poisson, et après, qu'est-ce que j'ai mis encore? J'ai mis de l'aspic, un aspic qui était d'ailleurs très décomposé, alors le tout puait d'une façon invraisemblable. Et j'ai commencé la séduction, qui a très bien marché. En fait, c'est question en question d'une semaine, elle était amoureuse de moi.
When the group returned to Paris in September, Gala stayed on for a few weeks in Cadaqués, and from that moment on, she was always at the painter's side.
She said to me, "My boy, we shall never separate." She was destined to be my Godiva, she who advances, my victory, my wife. But for this to happen, she had to heal me, and she healed me.
The morality of the Dalí house was far more conventional, and so it was quite clearly a revolution in the family home, which was difficult to swallow. They were able to accept it in due course, but not immediately.
And Dalí found that while his sister struggled to understand the painting lugubrious game, for example, Gala readily understood it.
That summer was all it took to bring about in Salvador the change that distanced him from his friends, from us, and even from himself. The river of his life, so well channeled, was diverted by the pressure from those complicated beings who were unable to understand anything of the classic landscape of Cadaqués. My father was seriously concerned. He tugged at his white hair, a sign that something was troubling him greatly, and his usual smiling, optimistic face betrayed a fear of some tragic event.
Dalí's relationship with Gala, begun that summer, prompted his father, the notary, to change his will and practically disinherited his son. The situation was made worse by the painting Dalí exhibited at the Germans Gallery in Paris, an image of the Sacred Heart on which Dalí had written, "Sometimes I spit with pleasure on the portrait of my mother," which caused the family a lot of unhappiness.
The fact that our subconscious impulses are often felt as extremely cruel to our conscious mind is yet another reason for not failing to manifest them when they are the friends of truth. The greater part of these manifestations were perfectly unjust, but what I was trying to do was to affirm my will to power and to prove myself that I was still inaccessible to remorse.
I think it was part of this process we have talked about, of transformation, of a radical break, and that it was a declaration to that effect. What happened is that it was interpreted as a particular moment and taken very literally. In any case, it was a provocation, and he knew that, didn't he?
His father let him go to Cadaqués with Luis Buñuel because he thought a period of rest and separation would help him rediscover his true self and his love of everything he had loved up until then. But his father's plan failed. The young Dalí was more and more caught up in the Surrealist movement, in which he had found a new means of expression through the subconscious, which revealed a whole world hidden by the conscious mind.
A few days later, I received a letter from my father, informing me that he had banished me irrevocably from the family. When I received this letter, my first reaction was to cut off my hair. But I went even further. I shaved my whole head. I went to bury my hair, so black, in a hole I dug in the beach for this purpose, and where I also buried the pile of shells of the sea urchins I had eaten at midday. After that, I climbed a small hill that overlooks the village of Cadaqués, and there, sitting under the olive trees, I spent 2 interminable hours contemplating the panorama of my childhood, my adolescence, and my present.
The artist's father found out about his son's intention of returning to Cadaqués. Furious, he tried in every way possible to keep Dalí and Gala out of Cadaqués. A good example of this is the letter Dalí's father sent to Luis Buñuel in Paris.
If you still maintain your friendship with my son, you could do me a favour. I do not write to him as I am ignorant of his address. He left yesterday evening for Paris, where I believe he will remain for 8 days. You will know where Madame resides and could advise my son not to seek to return to Cadaqués, for the simple reason that he will not be able to stay in that village for even 2 or 3 hours. Then things will become so complicated for him that he will be unable to return to France. Should this measure fail, I will resort to every means at my disposal, including assault on his person. My son will not go to Cadaqués. He should not go. He cannot go.
Dalí's father learnt of his intention of buying a house in or near Cadaqués. Dalí wanted to buy the fisherman's hut owned by Lydia Noguer, which he was using as a storeroom and studio. His father did all he could to prevent this, but Lydia, who felt a great affection for the young Dalí, took no notice. With the money he gained from selling his painting The Old Age of William Tell to the Viscount of Noël, Dalí was able to buy the fisherman's hut.
It was Dalí's triumph. That is to say, he couldn't come to Cadaqués, he couldn't have a house, but he had a house there, and at the very moment that his father told him he couldn't. So it's also a symbol of Dalí's triumph once again.
I spent the whole evening looking at the check, and for the first time I began to suspect that money was a very important thing. With that and Gala's money, we would go to Cadaqués and build a house large enough for the two of us. This would allow us to work and get away to Paris from time to time. The only landscape that I like is that of Cadaqués, and I didn't want to look at any other.
Grâce à une femme qui était folle mais sublime, cette femme nous abrita dans une toute petite bicoque de pêcheurs, que c'est là où nous nous trouvons exactement à ce moment.
So, this was the first hut, the one Lydia bought. A very small hut of 22 square meters, and this is where they made their life. A really confined space which they used for everything.
And what he did was to reinvent the hut for himself, to make it into a 22 square meter house, which amounts to a bedroom, a living room, a studio, and a small service space, which would be the one upstairs where there was a shower, kitchen and bathroom, and that was all.
Donc dans cet espace vital, le plus réduit qu'aucun être a encore vécu, il y avait l'atelier le plus immortel de tous, la salle à manger la plus gastronomique, où il y a eu le plus de bizarreries de cuisine, et le lit où il y a eu, en plus de notre amour, les rêves les plus fantastiques de l'époque contemporaine.
It was necessary to walk very carefully, almost sideways, between things, because it was an extremely small space. I wanted it to be small. The smaller, the more intrauterine. Not being in a position to carry out any of my delirious decorative ideas, I just wanted the exact proportions required for the two of us, and only the two of us.
But as an artist's studio, it didn't work. So Dalí did the whole conversion to transform it into his first studio at Portlligat.
And there was no electricity. There was no water. It was, he said, an aesthetic life. Here I learned to hone myself down and live with the bare necessities.
It was here, in Portlligat, that I learned to impoverish myself, to limit and hone my thinking so that it would be as efficient as an axe, where blood tasted like blood and honey tasted like honey. A life that was hard without metaphor or wine, a life with the light of eternity. The idle chit-chat of Paris, the lights of the city and of the jewels of the Rue de la Paix could not resist this other light, total, age-old, poor, as serene and intrepid as the concise brow of Minerva.
And then, of course, a month later he was able to buy this second hut, and he made this opening, and at once he had more space and more light.
So now we're in what would become the dining room, but was initially the second studio, the second cell of this cellular growth of the house. What did he do with this space? His aim was to turn it into a space to work and paint in. So what he needed first and foremost was to let light in. And what did he do to let light in? Well, basically make a window to let in overhead light from the north, which was very important to him, and convert what was a little window in a little fisherman's hut into a splendid panoramic window, which let the landscape into his house.
6 years had gone by since the family rift, and Salvador Dalí hadn't seen his father since 1929. During that time, he had worked tirelessly while moving between Paris, New York, and the house in Portlligat.
He was combining Paris with occasional trips to New York, and he set himself apart in Paris. He had two very important individual exhibitions. He was acquiring ever greater importance within the Surrealist group, and at the same time getting to know Americans who would open doors for him in the United States, which was to be a new phase for him. And he combined this house in Portlligat with two outstanding centres of art, one being Paris and the other the future, New York.
At the very beginning of the two huts, the upper one was a terrace which must have been splendid from the pictures we have of it. Here we see Gala and Dalí and the friends who came to visit them with a sunshade, the terrace furniture, etc. What happened is, in due course, these two terraces ended up becoming a new studio and a new living space.
His relationship with Gala was stable, and they formed a tandem, strengthened by the ever-increasing number of commissions. The time had come to close old wounds. On March the 3rd, 1935, the meeting and reconciliation with his family took place. That same year, the Dalís considered extending their home again, and they contacted David Pujol, the man who was to take charge of all the work that would be done on the house.
And he always knew how to get it done, however difficult it may have been. And he explains in his book that at times it was very difficult to achieve what Dalí was asking for. But nevertheless, he did his utmost and the house took shape, because Dalí was the architect of this house. He designed it, it was in his head. He even had them cut back the rock to make this fireplace, which he sketched, and which became a constant. He sketched many of the fireplaces, not only here, but later for Pujol too.
The painter's interest in the house was aesthetic. For example, that the roofs should form a series of steps leading down to the sea.
Dalí was always in a hurry to get things done, so when he was asked when he wanted something for, he would answer, "Yesterday." So it didn't take us long to do the bodies of the buildings. That was in the autumn of 35, and they had to be finished for the coming summer. The construction was completed, apart from some details, in July of 1936, a fateful date coinciding as it did with the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War.
The peaceful, contemplative life Dalí and Gala led in Portlligat was cut short by the imminent Spanish Civil War that divided the country and plunged it into misery and uncertainty. An uncertainty which the Dalís had sensed for some time, especially Gala, who went through the Russian Revolution.
The Civil War had begun. I knew it. I was certain of it. I had predicted it. And Spain, with another war, was to be the first country called to resolve with the stark reality of violence and blood. All of the insoluble ideological dramas of post-war Europe. All of the aesthetic anxiety of the isms polarized in two words: revolution and tradition.
When I went to Portlligat the next day, the Dalís told me they were alarmed and uneasy. I tried to reassure them, saying that nothing could happen, but they at once said that they weren't so sure. Gala said to me, "Mon petit, we cannot take any risks." Who could have known then that it would be 12 years before I saw them again, and before they could live in the house that meant so much to them?
During the years of the Spanish Civil War, the Dalís moved from place to place around Europe, waiting for their return to Portlligat. They were mostly in Italy and France, interspersed with sporadic trips to the United States, where Dalí had begun to take his place in the public eye, and where he saw the opportunity to make his fortune through his work.
In fact, we can say that Dalí hardly saw Portlligat from 1936 until 1948, a long time. The reasons for this were the Civil War, which kept him from returning to his country, and then the Second World War, which he spent in the United States.
I could feel the rise of the blind forces of fury, of destruction and death that would dislocate Europe. When 3 days later war was officially declared, Gala, always alert, immediately thought of our escape.
Gala left for Lisbon in 1940 and waited for Dalí to join her a few days later to make the definitive move to the United States. Before leaving, Dalí visited his family, who had suffered the consequences of the war. He travelled for 24 hours to get to his father's house in Cadaqués.
I had to pass through 10 villages in ruins. Their walls, like ghosts, were silhouetted in the moonlight like Goya's drawings of the horrors of battle. And my heart shrank in traversing that labyrinth of the miseries of war. In people's memory, the wounds of martyrdom had not yet healed, and my coming there at that time was met with mistrust. "Papa, who's there? What do you want?" "It's me." "Who?" "Me, Salvador Dalí, your son." So I knocked on my father's door in Cadaqués at 2 o'clock in the morning. I embraced my family. They gave me anchovies, sausages and tomatoes dressed with olive oil. I chewed the food, astonished and terrified. The morning followed my return to Cadaqués. I hugged the heroic Lydia, who had survived everything. I went with her to visit our house in Portlligat. I opened the door of my home. Everything was gone. There was nothing left of my library, absolutely nothing. Only walls covered with obscene drawings and conflicting political emblems. I pushed aside the waste with my foot and went outside, to the sun. New skin, new land, and a land of freedom, if that's possible. I have chosen the geology of a country that was new to me and was young, virgin, and free from drama, that of America. Upon arriving in America, I went almost immediately to Hampton Manor, the residence of Caresse Crosby, our friend from the time at Moulin du Soleil. We were all going to try to make the sun shine again, a little. That sun of France which had set. As soon as we arrived, I set up my easel with 2 large canvases, and I painted Spider of the Evening, Hope, and Resurrection of the Flesh.
He also saw how the centre of the art world was shifting from Paris to New York. So he was where he needed to be, despite the fact that he was exiled against his will. But I think that he knew how to read the situation well and positively, insofar as it wasn't a pleasant experience, and took the opportunity to find out how the United States worked, to consecrate himself once and for all.
Mr. Salvador Dalí gives a party. The Spanish painter of Surrealism dresses Mrs. Dalí in a unicorn's head, just to start things off. As hostess, she presides from a red velvet bed. Soldier Jackie Coogan and the still baffled Mr. Hope see the main course. The party is Surrealism, but them frogs is real.
And though his work evolves in tandem with his experiences, both personal and artistic, in the United States, the references to the landscape of Cadaqués and Portlligat are still there. He remembered with melancholy the lights and colours. And in his portraits of members of American high society, the presence of the landscape is a constant. Or in the animated short Destino with Walt Disney in 1946, where the landscapes and reminiscences of Portlligat are ever present.
In the United States, he sought the life he had here, and that's why he combined New York, the exhibition season, the art season in New York, and then the move to Monterey, California, where he always looked for landscapes like those of Portlligat, or which evoked Portlligat for him.
During this long period of absence, the Dalí family took care of the house. In 1944, Dalí's father wrote to his son to say that a close friend of Ana Maria, Dalí's sister, would live in and look after the house in Portlligat until he came back from the United States.
Ana Maria has let them have the house so they may live there without paying rent, but with the condition which they have fulfilled of repairing it at their expense, and have left it as good as new, so that the cession of the house in no way disadvantages you. Whereas left unoccupied, it would have deteriorated and you would have lost almost everything. We go on as before, with no news, and calmly await your return, which I am sure you wish for after 4 years of absence.
The bomb in Hiroshima exploded in an immaculate sky. Picado, light and noise, the Japanese who managed to escape said. I was painting Gala naked from behind when I felt the seismic shock of the explosion. It filled me with terror. What horrified me was the thought of the possibility of a chain of explosions that could have reached the whole world before I finished the perfect breast of my Gallerina. No one was safe, wherever they may have been. I decided to study without delay the best means of preserving my precious existence from the clutches of death, and I began to occupy myself in earnest with the formulas of immortality. Atomic melancholy, which I painted at the time, expresses the doubts and certainties that were born in me on the 6th of August, 1945.
The war was over, but it would take Dalí and Gala another 3 years to get back to Portlligat. Acclaimed as an international artist, he had achieved what he had dreamed of. His popularity in the United States can only be compared to that of movie stars, stars whom he knew and socialized with. His work was on show in the leading museums and salons.
Papa has a great desire for you to come home. You cannot imagine it. Everything he does shows how eager he is for your return. Auntie and I are also looking forward enormously to the day we shall all be reunited in our little house in Caracas, our little house from when we were small.
1948 came, and with it the long-awaited return of the Dalís to Spain and to the centre of his universe, Portlligat.
From the bridge of the ship, I looked at New York with satisfaction. What joy in finding once again the transcendent beauty of Portlligat, my kingdom, my platonic cave. I am in transit. I forget the pride of the skyscrapers and the agitation, the noise, the American frenzy. From the point of hyper-snobism at which I have arrived, I have no alternative but to feel I am a mystic.
The newspapers took an interest in Dalí and Gala's return. On August 1st, 1948, the daily La Vanguardia published an article recounting a meeting with the artist on the very day he arrived in Portlligat.
I am not the man who stole a landscape. The landscape stole me. I want to get back to painting my mythology with the precise places seen in a new way. In keeping with the new physics, it is no longer Freudian psychology that attracts me, but the geography of the places where mythologies live on.
Salvador Dalí has returned. The press take up the story. The family reunion continues. It's a very sweet moment, and of course he returned to his home and carried on with his project of extending it.
In the summer of 1948, Dalí and Gala, after 12 years' absence, had already decided to make Portlligat their place of permanent residence. Dalí needed a space to work in, but also to sort out and accumulate everything his life as a hotel nomad hadn't let him store away. His financial situation was comfortable. They could extend the house with a new cell and furnish it. They bought another hut, also of 22 square meters, and a piece of land, which is an olive grove, enabling them to add to the house what are now the living room and the library. Their builder, Pujol, also undertook this second extension, and since they worked without an architect, he followed the artist's indications in the form of letters, plans, designs and sketches.
With his departure for Paris in 1948, we started the work of rebuilding the hut so that it would be ready for his return the year after, just as we always did.
In the spring of 1949, the house was ready to be lived in. Gala took charge of the decorating and bought pieces of furniture from various antique shops in the area.
And he even had this mirror placed in a special way. He took care, you know, in positioning the mirrors, because he said that in this way, from the room, from the bedroom, he would be the first man in Spain to see the sunrise.
As I was having breakfast, I watched the sun rise, and it struck me that Portlligat, being geographically the most easterly point of Spain, every morning I am the first Spaniard to feel the sun's caress. Even in Figueres, which is 10 minutes from here, the sun arrives later.
The home that Dalí had had to abandon for years on account of the war had now been recovered, and his inner peace and his landscapes were re-established. But a new conflict emerged with the publication of his sister Anna Maria's autobiography, in which she declared her aversion to surrealism and rejection of Gala. With this book, old wounds were reopened, and the family was divided once again.
Salvador had said that, far from the family, when he saw our little house in Cadaqués, the scene of all his childhood and adolescence. It made him think of a lump of sugar covered in bitterness. This image could not be more real, though it must be remembered that the bitterness he saw was bitterness that he, thanks to the Surrealist group, had put there, making us victims of the decadent world which he unfortunately suggested, but from which all of us have always kept our distance.
His father found himself in a difficult situation, but he took his daughter's side, as the foreword he wrote for Anna Maria's book clearly shows. At the same time, the decision by Dalí's father and sister to sell some early paintings without his consent deeply offended Dalí. The break had become definitive. The artist closed the doors of his home in Portlligat to his family, and only opened them again a few days before his father's death.
In the 2 previous seasons he spent in Portlligat, Dalí had used the so-called Yellow Room as his studio, the room off the stairway leading to the first floor. However, this room was really too small for painting in reasonable comfort, so that same year, taking advantage of the neighbours' decision to sell their hut, which was next to the Dalí's house, they bought it without so much as discussing the price, since it was a unique opportunity to make another extension.
And Dalí had already begun to explore new formats, with much larger canvases, and here he didn't have the space he needed. Yes, in terms of light, yes, in terms of views, but not in terms of space.
As was his custom, Dalí drew up the basic scheme of how his new studio should be. He had thought it all out. The work was done, as before, during the part of the year they spent in Paris and New York.
The wall that formed a little vestibule with the door to his studio had to have the Dalí stamp. So the large door or opening for communication had to be a truncated isosceles triangle, and the fireplace situated next to this opening would be like the opening, but upside down. A very different design from what we were used to.
In the spring of 1950, the Dalís returned from their annual trip to Paris and the United States. His great desire was to see the studio completed.
At last he had a studio with maximum capacity to receive light from outside. At last he had a studio whose windows all looked out on the landscape of Portlligat, so that the landscape really did invade the studio completely. What's more, it was a studio whose space was really suitable for the new canvases, the new formats.
The first painting he did in the definitive studio was the Madonna of Portlligat, a supremely mystic nuclear work conceived over the winter and perfectly structured in his mind. All he needed was a suitable place to paint it, and the new studio was ideal.
Then he had the idea, aided by Pujol, for this metal framework, which at first was manual and later worked with a push button to move up and down, so that Dalí always had the part of the canvas he was painting in front of him. And then, with the mould stick and the brush, he would paint. He would go over to the bench and contemplate, and it was this to and fro. Here, for example, he finished the Madonna of Portlligat, he painted the Battle of Tetuan, the canvases for the ceiling of the Theatre Museum, and these and other large canvases would be rolled up and passed out through this window.
But even though he now had the new studio, Dalí wasn't progressing at his usual rate. His father was ill, and Dalí knew he had to go and see him before his inevitable death. In September of 1950, his father died. Dalí's grief was profound.
It was a major blow for Dalí, because his father was his mentor, and he would always have his example in mind. Dalí never forgot when his father once said to him, when they had been arguing together, "You will die alone and poor." And he sometimes said his life had been a struggle to prove his father wrong.
His father's death reawakened the fear of falling ill and dying that Dalí felt from an early age, and rekindled his interest in immortality, and in particular, hibernation.
I have made the decision that immediately after my demise, I am to be preserved to await the discovery that will allow humanity one day to revive the brilliant Dalí. I am certain that a cure will be found for cancer, that astonishing transplants will be performed, and that the rejuvenation of cells is only days away. Coming back to life will be an ordinary operation. I will await in liquid helium, without impatience.
In due course, Dalí returned to normal, to his daily routine of painting and writing. In short, he recovered his capacity to work and his extraordinary rhythm. He would get up early and paint until lunchtime. Afterwards, without lingering at the table, he took a short nap, then went back to the studio to paint for the rest of the day until evening. After years of exile, successes and tragedies, a great deal of work and effort, the cells have come together to form the great mother cell, his home.
Our house has grown exactly like a true biological structure, in cellular outgrowths. Each new impulse in our life has its corresponding new cell, a room. The nucleus was formed by the paranoid delirium of Lydia, who gifted us the first cell.
A few years have passed since the creation of his definitive studio. Dalí's house has been extended, with additions of gardens with olive trees around the house down to the sea. The house has become a place of pilgrimage for many people, and also for the media from all over the world. Dalí is a world-famous artist, and now everyone knows where to find him.
The first thing is that he now constructed part of the house as a public place, a reception area and a kind of open-air studio, where he could work in collaboration with visitors, other artists, younger people, people who contribute to the temperature of modernity.
Dalí went on with his life at Portlligat, a life tied to the evolution of his work, now expanding into happenings and performances, some of which now take shape in the outdoor spaces of the house.
It was this combination of innovation, but let's make this clear because I think it's interesting that Dalí, who was always experimenting, also wanted to explain how he experimented, and above all, for everyone to know how he experimented.
Of course, because he wanted to get through to people. He didn't want to be an artist enclosed in some kind of ivory tower who someone might be interested in someday. He wanted to get through to people. He wanted people to think about the things he was thinking about.
These were new forms of creation, because the world was becoming smaller for him, and his sense of this gave him a new need to grow where he could, in means, in thought, in the company of other artists, or cameras, or whatever. And above all, to project outwards, to the world, always.
Je considère la télévision, le cinéma, la presse, le journalisme comme un des grands moyens modernes d'avilissement et de crétinisation des foules. Mais j'adore les utiliser parce que, au point de vue pratique, après il n'y a plus de gens qui courent après Dalí et les tableaux se vendent plus cher. Et alors puisque ça existe, ça serait complètement idiot de ne pas en profiter, c'est tout.
The house was now a complex cellular structure which the Dalís had completed with the passage of time and had grown to include spaces like the swimming pool or what he called the Milky Way.
There is a whole pop aesthetic, Pirelli, the lip sofas, which is a Dalí classic. But the pool in this form, out of 1001 Nights, with some inspiration from the Alhambra.
Yes, it has exactly the perspective of the Alhambra pool.
Which is funny, because in fact the idea for the pool came from a piece of polystyrene, didn't it? You can see it in the studio.
Yes, it's in the studio.
The chronological evolution of the house is linked naturally to Dalí's artistic evolution, and to the moments in art that were happening at that time, because Dalí, with his curiosity, was very much aware of what was happening. He was interested in American abstract art, he was interested in hyperrealism, he was interested in pop art. But we can see that what he worked most at, really, was installation, and he was experimenting. But he would end the 80s once again with the great classics.
Even though Dalí was combining travel, happenings and work in his studio in the Portlligat house, from 1970, one project absorbed and concentrated much of his time, the Dalí Theatre Museum in Figueres, a centre in which he invested his energy and his hopes. In his studio, he prepared the great ceiling of the Palace of the Wind, where he depicted Gala and himself. The stereoscopic paintings born of his interest in optical illusions and double images, and many of the ideas and elements that make up the Dalí universe, brought together here almost as if this were a testament to his life and his art. In this task, he had the invaluable support of his friend, the artist Antoni Pichot. was invited to design a nightclub in Acapulco, and he gave it an oval form inspired by the sea urchin. It was never built, but Gala, who followed the process very closely, was impressed by the structure Dalí had conceived, and she asked him to apply it as the new extension at his home in Portlligat, the Oval Room.
Everything celebrates the cult of Gala, even the round room with its perfect echo, which crowns the whole built complex and is like the dome of this galactic cathedral.
This is the last cellular extension of the Portlligat house, which in turn became the first cellular extension of the castle of Pujol, which a few years later Dalí gave as a present to Gala.
Exactly 1 year ago, I discovered the ruins of the noble castle of Pujol. I took Gala there with her eyes closed, and I gave it to her. 3 months later, on our way back to New York, in the middle of the ocean, at 5 o'clock tea time, Gala took me by the hand and suddenly said to me, "I accept the castle of Pujol, but with only one condition, that you will only come to visit me at the castle by written invitation."
Because she found the atmosphere at Portlligat, where Dalí was visited by so many people, rather tiring, and she wanted a private space of her own.
Everyone thinks I'm a well-defended fortress, perfectly organized, when at most I might be a little tottering tower that, out of modesty, tries to cover itself with ferns and hide its flanks, already in ruins, to find a bit of loneliness.
Then they recalled an old pact between them that was made in the 1930s on one of their stays in Italy.
A trip to Italy on which Dalí promised her a castle, and with Pujol, I believe they gave solid form to a legend of a love story beyond the usual parameters. And I think that finding this castle was like the solidification of desire.
I had still to offer Gala a casket more solemnly worthy of our love. I therefore gave her a mansion raised on the remains of a 12th century castle at La Bisbal, the ancient castle of Pujol, where she would reign as absolute sovereign.
Gala was delighted. She especially liked the garden and the flowers, above all the roses, which reminded her of a garden in Crimea, where as a young girl she had spent the summer holidays. The castle was in a half-ruined state, both the interior floors and the roof, but the facades and especially the courtyards, which impressed Dalí, were in good condition.
Magnificent. It's fantastic. I like it. It's worth buying for the courtyard alone. What is more, I've seen something sublime on the facade. Not only is it cracked, but the form of a rough edge in the crack gives the impression that there's been a cataclysm there, an earthquake, that one part held firm while the other broke away and fell. Therefore, this should not be touched. It should be left as it is.
Dear Amelie, dear friend, as you will have realized, Pujol is my obsession. Ours, rather. So far, working together, we have always triumphed. At Portlligat, this little house has become famous, and so we have a great responsibility for a grand new success, you and I.
For the first time after so many years, I saw Gala really obsessed and very interested in the execution of the work on the castle. One day she said to me,
Emilie, time is a vital thing. Life is short, and so I have to be able to make use of the castle. Everything must be finished when we return from Paris and New York at the end of next May. If this results in a higher cost than envisaged, I do not mind. I have complete confidence in you.
Both Dalí and Gala had great hopes for their castle. He already had in mind a whole series of details for the decoration. Every day he had new ideas, but he was faced with opposition from Gala, who said, No, the castle is mine, and you must not intervene at all. The reconstruction of the castle is a matter for Emilie and me, so do not get involved. Dalí smiled and replied, Yes, Galucha. I very much agree on this. But he knew very well that he would be the one who would really complete all the details in the decoration, and so it was.
I have here the list of orders I have received from Gala so far for her castle. A roof 15 meters across that will represent in the Mediterranean sky a nocturnal hole from which surrealist objects fall. Chairs that do not touch the floor. 6 water fountain elephants with stork legs which flow into the pool with the 27 ceramic heads of Richard Wagner. Screens painted with optical illusion representations of heating radiators to conceal radiators. Solid gold taps and shower heads for the bathroom that will be painted black because, according to the rules of alchemy, treasures must always be hidden.
When we come to the first floor and see the first room, we're amazed by the imaginative deluge with which a setting has been created, which transports us to the Middle Ages. Yet it is very clear that we're not in the Middle Ages, but in the world of Salvador Dalí.
It's like the intermission of a play. Before we come in, all the elements are already there. Gala's throne, Gala's powerful presence, and then we come further in to reach even more hidden spaces, such as the library or the bedroom. But first, the magnificence.
Exactly.
Dalí used walls and half-ruined roofs very intelligently, creating unsuspected spaces of strongly contrasted dimensions. The result is a place with spaces of great beauty, such as the old kitchen converted into a bathroom or the piano room. Dalí was interested in the concept of ruin. In fact, all the houses that make up the Dalí triangle were rebuilt on top of ruined buildings. And in all 3, he always applied the same criterion. He reconstructed and redecorated them as if they were sets, with elements that evoke the classical period of the Renaissance, such as domes, columns, or sculptures. At Pujol in particular, there is a clear scenographic intention with links to classicism and romanticism.
Yes, for me, this whole area of the pool and the garden is the most scenographic part of the castle. And as Dalí himself said, I am an eminently theatrical artist.
None other than Visconti considered that he had a theatrical talent and a gift for the stage.
Then Dalí came. I met him in Rome when he was studying Bramante, and I was looking for an eccentric set designer, a magician, but one who really possessed, exactly as he demonstrated and as you like it, the gift of creating a stage set. For a month he immersed himself in the construction of his geometric forest of Raphaelesque trees, among shepherds, courtiers, sheep, and atomic pomegranates.
Because Dalí needed to step out of the canvas, he needed to go far beyond an exhibition room, and these were arts that allowed him to express himself in his entirety.
His creativity in the field of set design extended to the world of cinema, especially in the US, where Alfred Hitchcock chose him because he felt he was the artist best equipped to reflect the realm of the subconscious, a realm that Dalí ended up transporting into his own spaces.
I requested Dalí. Selznick, the producer, had the impression that I wanted Dalí for the publicity value. Yeah. That wasn't it at all. Dalí was the best man for me to do the dreams because that's what dreams should be.
Dalí took a special interest in the design of the exterior spaces of the castle. In Italy, he had been fascinated by the Baroque magic of the gardens of Bomarzo, not far from Rome.
Here again, a reference to classical mythology, to the labyrinth and to structures that are both seen and not seen. This play of visible and invisible, which is always very present in Dalí.
Dalí was also a great lover of forced perspectives. The one that interested him the most is the one in the Palazzo Spada in Rome.
Además que es quizá el arquitecto de la belleza suprema, Palladio también es el arquitecto, el arquetipo de lo daliniano por sus falsas perspectivas. Y Dalí constantemente, de una manera casi perenne, vive en falsa perspectiva.
What Dalí did with one of the paths in the garden was to project a perspective like the one in the Palazzo Spada, but instead of using columns, he used the trees, and in a very skillful way, he had the trees planted and the vegetation cut in such a way as to create this false perspective.
In 1974, the pool and the garden were constructed. With these interventions, the work on the castle of Pujol was completed.
The castle of Pujol was Dalí's gift to Gala, his lady, to whom he rendered vassalage and agreed not to enter the castle without her written permission.
I am giving you a Gothic castle, Gala.
I accept with one condition, that you only come to visit me at the castle by invitation.
I accept, since I accept in principle every condition in which there are conditions. It is the very principle of courtly love.
The day que Dalí decide give this castle and tell Gala, please, you catch this castle because it's one gift, tell no. Only one condition. You never coming in this castle see me, only with written invitation.
From your wife?
And Dalí is every day more masochist and love tremendously this condition. And now receive an invitation and possibly bring you this afternoon, and you look 1 second, the face of Gala open and close the door.
Gala became the impregnable castle that she had never ceased to be. Intimacy and, above all, familiarities make all passions diminish. Rigor of feeling and distances, as demonstrated by the neurotic ceremonial of courtly love, make passion grow.
Gala has always been considered the muse of Salvador Dalí, an inspiring muse and a mysterious woman. Loved by some, hated by others, she left no one indifferent. She was a woman of great intuition with an exceptional artistic sensibility who recognized the artistic and creative genius of intellectual artists such as Paul Eluard, Max Ernst and Salvador Dalí.
She was a woman, a strong character, Gala, powerful, very cultured. And she was in fact one of the few women to be accepted by the Surrealist group.
The relationship with the Surrealist group was always, I believe, very conflictive, because the Surrealist group, however much they strove to demonstrate the contrary, was a group of petty bourgeois captained by André Breton, who wanted the world to adapt itself to their needs. Then along comes Gala, who does not want the world to adapt to Breton's needs, and I think it turned into a conflict.
In 1917, Gala married Paul Eluard, who introduced her into the artistic and literary circles of Paris, where she was one of the few women accepted by the Surrealist group. In 1929, Gala met Salvador Dalí, and they fell in love. Eluard reluctantly accepted that his wife was leaving him for a young artist 10 years younger than she was, an emotionally unstable artist with an uncertain future.
Gala saw what Dalí was. And of course, suddenly she meets this guy, fascinating, totally crazy, as he must have been at that moment, spontaneous. And she realizes that she has a great deal to learn, to look at, to shape. She has in front of her a treasure. She has a gift. We're always ready to admit that suddenly great artists find their muses. Well, I believe that Gala was a great artist who found her muse in Dalí, and on that account she left a successful poet, a fascinating life of great pomp with a great poet of Breton, and went to live, well, almost with fishermen, with country people.
The most essential thing for me is love. It is the axis of my vitality and of my brain, the spring that launches me forward with elasticity and agility, with more clarity and precision in all the movements of my senses, my impulses, my knowledge.
Gala had begun to explain to me in minute detail the reasons for her desire, and it suddenly occurred to me that she too had her inner world of desires and failures, and moved with her own rhythm between the poles of lucidity and madness.
Throughout his autobiography, Dalí tells us about Gala in relation to desire and the discovery of the sexual act.
I kissed her on the mouth, inside her mouth. It was the first time I did this. I had not suspected until then that one could kiss in this way. With a single leap, all the parsifals of my long-bridled and tyrannized erotic desires rose, awakened by the shocks of the flesh.
And then, also in his autobiography, in an ironic tone, the most surrealist Dalí associates food with the loved one, who has to be devoured in order to arrive in this way at total love.
On pratique la cérémonie liturgique de manger Dieu vivant. J'ai toujours dit que si Gala, que c'est l'être que j'aime le plus au monde, mourait, et soudainement il devenait petite comme une olive, évidemment, je la mangerai. Jamais je l'enterrerai, je la mangerai.
Since Malaga, I had become Gala's pupil. She had revealed to me the principle of pleasure. She taught me also the principle of reality in all things. She also taught me the principle of proportion which slumbered in my intelligence. She was the angel of equilibrium, the precursor of my classicism.
Gala became the model and muse that Dalí had been waiting for. A muse that inspired him in the same way that other women inspired the Renaissance painters that Dalí so admired. Galarina is a clear example of this.
I called it Galarina because Gala is to me the muse that La Fornarina was to Raphael. In short, every good painter who aspires to create authentic masterpieces must first marry my wife, Gala.
Gala took it on herself to provide Dalí with the financial stability he needed in order to dedicate himself exclusively to art. It was she who, with great tenacity, sought out the best dealers, the most prestigious galleries, and the most refined clients to buy, sell, and exhibit Dalí's work.
In fact, Dalí never had a dealer or a gallery to represent him. Gala did it all. We see the two of them with the influential New York gallerist Julian Levy. This was part of her role, the role she took on, and she performed it very well.
She creates a place, a comfort zone, as we would say in contemporary terms, which is to be that woman, as when she writes the letter to her father, which she reads to her husband, when she looks after him, as Russian women do. And from that parapet, she comes up with lots of different personas, between which she modulated throughout her life.
I, like all of us Russian women, personally help my husband in everything. I try to lighten his load. I have to do it, and in any case I enjoy it. I often serve as his model. I also act as secretary and take charge of everything to do with the practical part of our life. I do all that because he, as you see, is totally immersed in the creative world, in his work. He is not able to deal with these trifles. I'm not very brilliant either. But we live like all artists, we work, and that is the most important thing, the possibility of expressing oneself thanks to a talent.
Gala alone was a witness to my furies, my despairs, my fugitive ecstasies, and my relapses into the bitterest pessimism. She alone knows to what point painting became for me at this period a ferocious reason for living, while at the same time it became an even more ferocious and unsatisfied reason for loving her, Gala. For she, and she alone, was the reality, and all that my eyes were capable of seeing was she, and it was the portrait of her that would be my work, my idea, my reality.
In his autobiography, The Secret Life of Salvador Dalí, the artist explains how at a crucial moment in his life, thanks to Gala, his work evolved, fusing surrealism with classicism.
My prisons were the condition of my metamorphosis, but without Gala they threatened to become my coffins. And again it was Gala who with her very teeth came to tear away the wrappings patiently woven by the secretion of my anguish, and within which I was beginning to decompose. "Arise and walk," I obeyed her. "You've accomplished nothing yet. It is not time for you to die." My surrealist glory was worth nothing. I must incorporate surrealism into tradition. My imagination must become classic again. I had before me a work to accomplish for which the rest of my life would not suffice. Gala made me believe in this mission.
This time I will send you a catalogue of the exhibition, and you will see that his paintings cannot be done in a quarter of an hour like most of modernism. His technique is classical, and the content, we could say, is an absolutely new movement with a symbolic meaning.
Gala signified all of his intelligence, all his culture, all his creativity, all his pragmatic sense of life, because she was also... She could serve as a crutch, right? But she was absolutely essential for Dalí's life, his creative and pragmatic life.
Since my surrealist period, I have signed my best paintings Gala, Salvador Dalí. It is not necessary to be Sartre to affirm that the name is the person, but it is necessary to be Dalí to affirm that the superperson, the Superman of Nietzsche, and the Dalinian superwoman are his castle.
I think that Gala was in camouflage all the time, which is to say that from that point of view, I think of Gala almost as a kind of postmodern heroine.
We said before that the title The Visible Woman is almost a contradiction, really, because, in fact, Gala is the invisible woman, the one we do not get to know, right? And this is part of her mystery.
From the beginning, I imposed a very personal norm that has nothing to do neither with morals nor with ethics or with anything. I adopted it by and for myself, and it consists in not agreeing to any request for an interview, in not making any statement for the press. I want to go down in history as a legend, when everything is over and done with, when everything that is now cloudy is clean. When time has passed, things will be said about me, for good or ill, but for now, I do not want anything to be said.
On June 10th, 1982, Gala died in Portlligat and was taken to her castle of Pujol, where she is buried. Just a few months before, in view of the precarious state of his wife's health, Dalí took it on himself to prepare a crypt in the space formerly used to store the tithes.
Finally, we buried Gala in her tomb, which had been made ready. A priest from a nearby town officiated at the ceremony, and Dalí, deeply moved, managed to attend the funeral for a few moments before leaving abruptly.
Dalí had to leave his wife's funeral. It was too painful for him. Downcast, he retired to the piano room. He did not want anyone near him other than his faithful friend David Pujol, who was also an artist.
En tot moment al seu costat, des dels instants en què enterraven a Gala fins als instants que jo l'acompanyava, no el vaig deixar mai ni un sol d'aquests moments. Cosa que m'havia demanat Gala que ho fes, que no abandonés mai el Dalí perquè no sabia estar sol.
The death of Hector, represented in the tapestry in this room, was quite significant in those moments of pain. During the funeral, Dalí and Pujol sat for over an hour in front of the tapestry. According to Pujol, Dalí was absent, contained, even expressionless, staring into space. To distract and rouse him, Pujol talked about the tapestry in front of them, depicting a scene from the Iliad of Hector being killed by a spear. Eventually, Dalí looked up and focused on the scene, and after a moment's reflection made the following comment.
This is what has happened to me, Antoni. The final spear thrust.
His magnificent house of cards has collapsed. Gala was dead.
We have to think that Dalí, it's what we were saying, isn't it? For some years he had been aware that he was getting old. And on top of that, in 1982 he found himself alone. For the first time in his life he was alone in the world because he no longer had Gala. He had no one to cover reality for him.
After Gala's death, Dalí didn't want to go back to Portlligat. He told Antoni Pujol that he intended to stay at the castle to be close to her.
I've been worried and thinking all night, and I've made this decision. I do not want to go back to Figueres anymore. I want to stay in the castle.
Dalí moved into Gala's room. He slept in her bed and shut himself up in the castle, not going outside and seeing almost no one except for the staff and Antoni Pujol.
Es un hombre que se ha ido encerrando en sí mismo poco a poco. Y es comprensible que ahora no tenga deseos de ser el Dalí público, el Dalí que se daba a todo el mundo, que recibía a todos sus conocidos y hasta muchos amigos que le iban a visitar.
Il a voulu qu'on se voie dans l'obscurité totale. Alors ça aussi, jusqu'au bout donc, il jouait au prince. Il adorait Ludwig de Bavière, le roi Louis II de Bavière. Et il avait lu quelque part, il m'avait raconté cette histoire, que Louis II de Bavière avait rencontré Wagner, dont il était très amoureux, dans le noir, dans l'obscurité totale. Alors ça lui avait plu, cette histoire. Et bien même à la fin de sa vie, dans l'état de décadence et de décrépitude dans lequel il était, il a voulu encore jouer au roi. Il m'a dit, on va se voir dans le noir total.
The days were passing and Dalí was still no better. Artur, his butler, occasionally got him to walk in the garden.
On one of these walks, on which I also accompanied him, he pointed with his cane to the wall that was near us and said,
"Tell them to raise it 1/2 meter so that I cannot be seen from the neighboring field."
A few days later, the wall had been built up. Dalí was enclosed in on himself, absent. His health was deteriorating with every day that passed. He did not want to eat, and the nurses no longer knew what to do with him. He didn't want to see anyone.
Sí. Naturalmente que la desaparición de Gala ha sido para él un golpe le han quitado pues un ser que ha vivido con él toda su vida y que lo pilotaba en muchos aspectos y que era pues una persona que le... Pero no creo que sea decisorio en su estado actual. No. Creo que él se fabrica el encontrarse peor de lo que está.
Antoni Pujol came over every day from Figueres to visit him and tried to encourage him to regain his enthusiasm for painting. But he did not find it easy. Dalí was not the same. From his bed, he asked him to close the curtains so as not to let the sunlight in.
Close the curtains. That is life.
Many days when I arrived in the morning and asked him how he was, he would answer me, I'm dying, and things like that. Then, to change the tone of sadness and give it a brighter turn, I would say, why don't you sing it to me, like that song I'm sure you know that goes, Con el ay, con el marabay, con el con el marabú, ay, que me con el marabú, ay, que me And he immediately opened his eyes and said, San Juan de la Cruz, which is exactly how the bolero Marabú continues. Then Dalí became more lively and made the nurses laugh by singing all kinds of nonsense and songs of that time.
In those difficult days, in order to stimulate his friend, Pujol brought him a lot of sketchbooks so he would have them to hand and feel prompted to draw or paint.
One day I arrived and found him with one of those sketchbooks in his hands. I said to myself, at last, and I asked him, what are you doing? And he tore out a sheet in tremendous ill humour and threw it on the floor. When he threw the first sheet, I said nothing. Then he threw 6 or 7 balls of paper in a row, as if expressing a feeling of suppressed rage. Then I said in a rather pacifying tone, I'm sure this thing you're doing responds to some feeling you have, but let me tell you that it's absurd. Give it a function, that's what it's for. And he threw another ball of paper on the floor, so I said, that's okay, carry on. If you like, we'll bring you more so you can cover the floor with crumpled paper. Then he beckoned to me to come closer and he snarled, "Dying is probably like crumpling up sheets of paper."
But Antoni Pichot did not give up. He knew that the only way to stimulate Dalí was through painting.
"I need you to recapture the spark of the painting, which is my religion. You know that I don't believe in anything, only in good painting. I believe in Rembrandt's The Slaughtered Ox, the brushstrokes of which, as our teacher Núñez said, deserve to be kissed. You remember? If I can't follow this cult of my religion, then I will stop coming."
I promise you that tomorrow I will do something again.
I vaig aconseguir que tornés a pintar quadros, jo considero molt valuosos. Hi ha una sèrie d'obres que estan, molts d'ells en el Teatre Museu Dalí, i alguns també estan a Madrid. Va arribar a fer obres d'una gran consistència Dalí en els seus darrers temps.
Antoni Pichot's persistence paid off, and by the end of 1982, Dalí was active once more, working obsessively in the sketchbooks, drawing symbols inspired by the catastrophe theory of the French mathematician René Thom, and creating what he called catastrophe form writing.
When I finally got him to paint again, this is what he came up with, which I found wonderful. They were, in a sense, the signs of his ailments, but expressed in an absolutely free, fantastic way. He filled whole sketchbooks, drawing in those same sketchbooks from which he had torn out the pages and crumpled them up. He covered page after page with these catastrophiform signs.
After a period of emotional and physical crisis, Dalí was ready to pick up his brushes again. He chose a spot in the main hall of the castle, next to a window, and set up his easel there, adapting it as an improvised studio which was to be his last studio. Dalí gives form in these works to the subjects that obsess him, immortality and the nostalgia for a past that will not return again.
Mine is no longer an imagination in the service of caprice and dreams, or of automatism. Now I paint meaningful things, taken directly from my own existence, from my illness, or from my most present memories.
One of these oil paintings, will be arriving later, around 5, is a curiously enigmatic image of a dark interior. At the back of this work lies the theme of mortality, and the fact that it depicts a removal van takes us back to Dalí's youth, when he heard André Breton declare, "I ask to be conducted to the cemetery in a removal van."
This painting, Swallow's Tail, from 1983, is the last oil Dalí painted, and he painted it at Pujol. It is, then, another reference to the catastrophe theory of René Thom, in which Dalí was interested at the time, from various angles, including the scientific.
These oils from Dalí's last period, marked by his interest in catastrophe theory, bear witness to a world that is ending, something that is collapsing. They are a kind of self-portrait of his final stage, and in a way, these works also have a premonitory significance.
Salvador Dalí suffered minor burns when his bedroom at Pujol caught fire. A fire which completely destroyed Dalí's room broke out at dawn yesterday at the painter's habitual residence. Dalí, who is relatively unharmed according to those closest to him, has minor burns on his right thigh and right forearm and was slightly affected by the smoke. The doctors recommend that Dalí be moved to a hospital. The painter Antoni Pichot attributed the cause of the fire to a short circuit.
The nurses had a bell installed in Dalí's room in case he should need anything. That night, in a state of nerves, Dalí pressed the button so many times that it caused a short circuit and started a fire in his bed. Dalí had to be admitted to a clinic in Barcelona to treat his burns. But on his way to Barcelona, he asked for the ambulance to take him to his museum in Figueres so he could see it at night, probably thinking that he would never do so again. So in the middle of the night, the nurses, the doctor, and Dalí's usual retinue accompanied the injured painter as he visited the rooms of his museum one by one before being taken to the clinic. He paid special attention to the boat that he and Gala often used when they lived at Portlligat, which that very day had been put in place as part of a central installation in the courtyard.
Many people will not know the geographical locations of Figueres and Pujol, but it took a special effort for a person in his condition to go to Figueres, which was quite out of the way. In other words, it says a lot about what he was thinking, about what was on his mind at that moment.
During this convalescent period, as the day approached when he would be discharged and leave the clinic, the dilemma as to his future residence returns. He could not go back to the castle because the fire meant that repairs were needed and he could not live there. As Dalí was well on the way to recovery, the question was put to him. His answer was immediate and concise.
I will go to Figueres, to the Torre Galatea.
The Torre Galatea, formerly known as the Torre Gorgot, is an annex to the Dalí Museum. The tower dates from the 17th century and preserves the only visible remnants of the old medieval wall of Figueres. Salvador Dalí had refurbished it, connected it to the theatre museum, and given it the name of Torre Galatea. In addition, in honor of all the enigmas surrounding Gala, he transformed its general appearance with bright colors, loaves of bread, and eggs on the facade.
Precisely at that time, Dalí at Pujol was working on the Torre Galatea. It was from Pujol that he redesigned and decorated the Torre Galatea. What I'm saying is that we can clearly see that Dalí in Pujol was thinking more and more about his real masterpiece, which is the Dalí Theatre Museum.
Prolonging my theatre museum of Figueres, I declare that from now on Torre Gorgot will be called Torre Galatea. I raise a monument unique in the world in honor of all enigmas.
The curious thing is that he returned to his hometown, Figueres, which he had left long before. In fact, he wanted to come back here to feel close to the museum, the church where he had been baptized, and also the place where his father organized his first painting exhibition. He wanted to close the circle. Indeed, he wanted to close it so much that he even said that he was to be buried in the museum. I believe that that in itself is the total culmination of his work.
In October 1984, Dalí settled permanently in the Torre Galatea, in a set of rooms that communicated internally with the museum.
I think another of the reasons why he chose it is also because there is a huge window that looks out on the wall of the museum, and that was an absolutely direct connection that he established with his museum.
In his room, Dalí often spent hours looking at the stone wall opposite. This reminded him of what Leonardo da Vinci said about being able to see images of great battles in the stains on a wall, and of Piero di Cosimo, among the tuberculosis patients who saw dragons and other monsters in the sputum coughed up onto the walls. Dalí, who had always known how to see beyond reality, found in these visions a form of escape.
He led a very closed life, and he chose to see only a few people, his staff of nurses, his whole team, and especially Antoni Pujol. It was interesting because I was with Dalí for some of this time. In fact, he had asked me to read Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time to him, and we would read articles from the Scientific American, because he had not lost his curiosity. He still had that very profound vision and that curiosity, which he never lost for a moment.
Dalí's doctors were visiting him regularly, and although his condition was stable, he was fully aware that he was in a process of irreversible deterioration. Pujol, always close to his friend, was by his side, supporting him.
Sobretot quan jo li deia, va, estigues tranquil, se n'han anat els metges, t'han fet tots els anàlisis que corresponia, han trobat que no tens cap dolència preocupant, estàs molt bé, els metges han dit que estàs perfectament bé de salut. I deia, sí, diu, em moriré completament curat.
They were very hard moments for Dalí because he was someone who had created that mask, his persona as such, which was one of his works, and he was perfectly aware of his decline, precisely because he retained that lucidity, that magnificent mind he always had, while his physical condition was failing to keep up with it.
Every night before going to bed, Dalí would always ask Antoni Pichot the same thing. He wanted to hear Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. In the opera there's an apotheosis in which Tristan descends from the sky and trumpets sound. This represents the arrival of Tristan, and it was only then that Pichot leaves and Dalí would fall asleep.
Dalí was always interested in science, in the possibilities it offered him, in optical phenomena, and he was always interested in new languages.
That was the way that Dalí found to go on explaining the inexplicable, by way of science, when it seemed to him that other approaches had been exhausted.
And a symposium of determinism and freedom was organized in his museum, entitled Process of Chance.
El procés a l'atzar de l'any 85 que li va organitzar els amics de Barcelona, en Wagensberg i en René Tom i Lilia Prigogine i tota aquella reunió de premis Nobel i savis que el van venir a visitar aquí, a la Torre Galatea, i que ell els va rebre tots, que era una reunió científica amb debat que es va organitzar en el pati del museu, ho seguia per un canal intern de televisió.
Mathematics has nothing to say to reality.
That is your point of view, it's not mine.
It was the confluence of the search for a faith he could not find, and the support that science gave him in seeking to explain the process of chance, of chaos. And in fact, quantum mechanics and physics helped him look for answers that, in the last analysis, he did not find.
Creo en Dios, pero no tengo la fe. Por las matemáticas y por las ciencias particulares, sé que es indiscutible que Dios tiene que existir, pero no me lo creo. Y eso es terrible. Cada vez me acerco más, pero no me lo creo.
¿Te gustaría creérselo?
Entonces todo estaría resuelto, sobre todo el problema de la muerte.
What Dalí was seeking in science were new foundations from which to approach the immortality he so desired and overcome death, always so present in his life and his work.
I enjoyed tremendously every single moment of my life because the death all time is very close. Watch me, and the death like it catch me. And every 5 minutes, the death no catch me. I enjoy tremendously. Catch a little piece of dishy water, you send me little tea or something. Everything becoming one tremendous pleasure because the death surrender me, and because the death is so close, it's possible to make erotic every single piece of my life.
I have lived with death since I have known I breathe, and it kills me with a cold voluptuousness only comparable to my lucid passion to outlive it every minute, every infinitesimal second of my consciousness of being. This constant, stubborn, fierce, terrible tension constitutes the whole story of my quest.
There comes a time, especially in the last period, I think, when what concerns him most, more than physical death, is the death of the intellect, the non-transcendence.
Step by step, little by little, and day by day, it was clear that one more page of his transit towards the end was turning. And Dalí saw it and accepted it. Dalí, the eternal observer, was the spectator of his own end.
Va estar lúcid fins l'últim dia de la seva vida. Es va anar apagant com una espelma o com una bugia, com una llum que se li va acabar Però no va perdre mai la lucidesa, ni la intel·ligència, ni la capacitat decisòria de les seves coses, que això també és molt important.
De moment no em puc pas separar del meu museu, no puc pas prendre vacacions i no tinc que treballar tots els detalls de la fatxada, l'estructuració de dintre, el gran objecte. I s'ha de dir que no és pas un museu, és un immens subjecte surrealista.
In fact, the Dalí Theatre Museum goes much further. It is also the consolidation of his desire for transcendence and immortality.
In spite of Dalí's health problems, his last stage had moments of great richness. He liked to look back, to remember, to go over his youth. He remembered García, Lorca, Buñuel, the tangos of Irusta, and De Mare.
Caminito amigo, yo también me voy. Desde que se fue, nunca más volvió. Seguiré su paso, caminito adiós, caminito que todas las tardes feliz recorría cantando mi amor.
In June 1932, there suddenly came to my mind, without any close or conscious association, which would have provided an immediate explanation, the image of the Angelus of Millet. This image was composed of a very clear visual representation and in color. It was nearly instantaneous and was not followed by other images. It appeared to me absolutely modified and charged with such latent intentionality that the Angelus of Millet suddenly became for me the most troubling, the most enigmatic pictorial work, the densest and richest in unconscious thoughts that I had ever seen.
This painting produced in him a dark anguish so acute that the memory of these two immobile silhouettes pursued him for years, with the constant disquiet produced by the continual ambiguous presence.
There is another fundamental theme in Dalí, which is his interpretation of Millet's The Angelus, and is an interpretation that is made through the paranoid critical method, a method that was his contribution to the Surrealist movement and made him stand out over the others. Because he engaged with paranoid thinking and understood that reality is never as we see it. The more deeply we look at reality, the more interpretations we can find.
While we may see this painting as a conventional scene of two peasants reciting the midday Angelus prayer, Dalí, in contrast, saw two parents mourning the death of their son, because he did not interpret the caricat as a caricat, but rather as the coffin of a child. Surely, in fact, it is a direct reference to both the premonition of death, which is what the icon of Millet's The Angelus ended up being for Dalí, and to the obsession with his brother's death that stayed with him all his life.
Je portais dans mon corps et dans mon âme le cadavre agrippé de ce frère mort, parce que mes parents parlaient constamment de cet autre Salvador à propos de moi, en disant il ne faut pas que ça arrive comme Salvador qui était enrhumé, il faut le mettre cache-nez. Enfin, j'étais tout le temps qu'on parlait de moi, on parlait de l'autre. Alors, pour me séparer de cet autre frère mort, j'étais obligé justement à jouer au génie dans le sens d'affirmer toutes les minutes que moi je n'étais pas de l'autre, que moi j'étais pas mort, et alors j'étais forcé de commettre et de perpétrer tous ces genres d'excentricité, que c'est le côté loufoque que les gens croient voir dans Dalí, et que justement c'est le côté le plus tragique de mon existence.
And it was in the Torre Galatea, right next to the church where he was baptized, and opposite the wall of the building in which he had his first exhibition, that Dalí spent the last days of his life before finally being extinguished on January 23rd, 1989.
Tell me this, what do you think will happen to you when you die?
Myself no believe in my death.
You will not die?
No believe in general in the death, but in the death of Dalí, absolutely not. Not. She believed in my death becoming very untried is almost impossible.
You fear death?
Yes.
Death is beautiful, but you fear death.
Exactly. Because Dalí is contradictory and paradoxical in anything.
In fact, I believe that we have had to reach the 21st century to appreciate all of the capacity for rebellion and that appeal to individual freedom that Dalí makes. In effect, Dalí invites us to be transgressors through provocation. There is a constant provocation, and we feel provoked because we are being provoked by a thinking machine.
To enter into his mind is to enter fully into his time, and thus to enter into the whole world of the 20th century.
Estic pensant en Marcel Duchamp, estic pensant en Buñuel, estic pensant en García, Lorca, estic pensant en tots els personatges que ell va tractar i que tots ells van alimentar l'art d'aquest segle XX, que si no hagués sigut per ells hagués sigut una època realment molt trista.
Heaven is what I've been seeking all along, and through the density of confused and demonic flesh of my life. Heaven. Alas for him who's not yet understood that. When with my crutch I stirred into the putrefied and worm-eaten mass of my dead hedgehog, it was heaven I was seeking. When from the summit of the Molí de la Torre I looked far down into the black emptiness, I was also and still seeking heaven. Gala, you are reality. And what is heaven? Where is it to be found? Heaven is to be found neither above nor below, neither to the right nor to the left. Heaven is to be found exactly in the center of the bosom of the man who has faith. At this moment, I do not yet have faith, and I fear I shall die without heaven. My triumph will lie in the fact that I was able to overwhelm my period and at the same time achieve immortality. My triumph is the gold that accounts for my present-day success and nurtures my eternal genius.